In late spring of 52 BC, Julius Caesar, the man who had conquered 400 Gallic tribes, who had never lost a major battle, who Romans believed was touched by the gods themselves, stood at the base of a hill fortress and watched his legions bleed. By sunset, 700 of Rome's finest soldiers lay dead on Gergovia's slopes, and 46 centurions, the backbone of Roman military power, had been butchered trying to pull their men back from disaster. Think about this for a second. Caesar had conquered Gaul in 6 years of relentless campaigning. He had crushed armies twice his size. He had built a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days just to prove he could. And now, a 20-year-old Gallic chieftain named Vercingetorix had just handed him his first and only defeat. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see Caesar forever. First, the tactical trap that turned Roman discipline into a death sentence. Second, why Caesar's own soldiers ignored his recall signal and charged to their doom. And third, the moment Caesar himself nearly died on that hill, a fact Roman historians tried to bury. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did a fortress perched on vertical cliffs hold off the greatest military machine in history? What made Roman soldiers, famous for their discipline, suddenly become suicidal? Why did this single defeat nearly unravel everything Caesar had built? And how did Vercingetorix turn Caesar's greatest strength against him? To understand how Rome's perfect military system shattered against Gergovia's walls, we need to go back to when Caesar's conquest of Gaul was falling apart. March 52 BC. Julius Caesar sat in his winter quarters at Ravenna, reading dispatch after dispatch that all said the same thing. Gaul was burning. 6 years of conquest, 6 years of brutal subjugation, 6 years of carefully constructed alliances and puppet kings. All of it was collapsing in a matter of weeks. Vercingetorix, a young Arverni nobleman who Caesar had never even heard of 3 months ago, had done what no Gallic leader had managed before. He had united the tribes, not through force, not through tradition, but through something far more dangerous: a shared hatred of Rome and a strategy that actually worked. The numbers were staggering. Caesar had spent 6 campaigning seasons subduing 400 Gallic tribes. He had killed over 1 million Gauls. He had enslaved another 1 million. He had built a reputation as Rome's most brilliant general through sheer, relentless brutality, the kind that made future rebellions seem impossible. His legions had marched from the Atlantic to the Rhine, from the English Channel to the Pyrenees. They had built bridges in days, fortresses in weeks, conquered nations in months. Caesar himself had written dispatches to the Roman Senate describing his victories in such glowing terms that senators proposed public Thanksgiving festivals lasting 20 days, the longest in Roman history. And now all of it was unraveling because of one man who had learned to fight the way Romans fought. Here's what made Vercingetorix different from every other Gallic leader Caesar had faced. The others had fought with courage, with ferocity, with overwhelming numbers. They had charged Roman lines in massive, undisciplined waves, believing that valor and fury could break Roman formations. Caesar had crushed them all using the same tactical playbook. Let the barbarians exhaust themselves against disciplined infantry, then counterattack when they broke. It had worked against the Helvetii, the Belgae, the Nervi, every major tribe that had dared to resist. The formula was simple. The results were predictable. Rome won, always. Vercingetorix refused to play that game. Instead of massing warriors for pitched battles, he mobilized entire populations. Instead of defending fixed positions, he evacuated them and burned them to the ground. Instead of challenging Roman legions directly, he starved them, harassed them, bled them slowly through 1,000 small cuts. He had studied under Roman cavalry commanders as a young man. actually served with Caesar's forces. And he understood something that would terrify Rome's military establishment. Roman invincibility was built on logistics. Take away their supply lines, deny them forage, force them to fight hungry and exhausted, and suddenly those perfect formations started to crack. By March, the cracks were showing. 3 separate uprisings had erupted simultaneously across Gaul, coordinated, synchronized, clearly planned months in advance. Roman supply convoys were being ambushed. Isolated garrisons were besieged. Gallic tribes that had sworn loyalty to Rome were suddenly declaring for Vercingetorix. The young king had accomplished in 3 months what decades of Gallic resistance had failed to achieve. He had made Caesar afraid. Caesar stared at the dispatches and realized the terrible truth. For the first time in his military career, he was facing an opponent who understood Roman warfare as well as he did. An opponent who refused to make the mistakes that had doomed every other barbarian army. An opponent who was turning Caesar's own strategies against him. What happened next would either save Caesar's conquest or destroy everything he had built. And it would all come down to a fortress on a hill that Rome's greatest general couldn't take. The rebellion began in January with a massacre. The Carnutes tribe attacked the Roman trading post at Cenabum, modern-day Orléans, and butchered every Roman citizen they could find. Merchants, tax collectors, traders, their wives, their children. The killing was systematic, ritual, designed to send a message. Rome's protection meant nothing anymore. Within days, the news had spread across Gaul through a communication system the Romans still didn't fully understand. Tribes that had been peaceful for years suddenly rose up. Roman supply depots burned. Isolated garrisons were surrounded and annihilated. And everywhere the name being chanted was Vercingetorix, the great warrior king. The speed of the uprising defied Roman intelligence. Caesar's spy network, the same system that had kept him one step ahead of Gallic resistance for 6 years, suddenly went dark. Informants stopped reporting. Messengers disappeared. Within 72 hours of the Cenabum massacre, the rebellion had spread 300 miles. Think about that for a second. Without telegraphs, without radio, without any technology beyond signal fires and mounted couriers, Vercingetorix had coordinated a simultaneous uprising across a territory the size of modern France. Roman commanders accustomed to fighting isolated tribal revolts found themselves facing a coalition war. Here's what the Roman chronicles tried to hide. The Gauls had been planning this for months, possibly years. The massacre at Cenabum wasn't spontaneous rage. It was a signal. A starting gun that triggered pre-positioned cells across the entire country. The Carnutes had been chosen specifically because their territory held religious significance. Their druids were respected across tribal boundaries. When they struck first, it gave the uprising spiritual legitimacy. Every tribe that joined wasn't just rebelling against Rome. They were answering a sacred call. The numbers told the story of Rome's nightmare. By February, 15 major tribes had openly declared for Vercingetorix. Another 20 were providing covert support. That represented over 2 million people, roughly a third of Gaul's entire population, suddenly unified under a single war leader. Roman tax collection stopped overnight. Trade routes closed. The carefully constructed system of client kings and puppet governments that Caesar had spent 6 years building collapsed like a house made of parchment. But here's where Vercingetorix proved his genius. He didn't just call for warriors to fight. He organized them. Every tribe that joined the rebellion had to contribute specific quotas. The Aedui provided 15,000 infantry and 800 cavalry. The Arverni the same. The Senones, 12,000 infantry The Betrayal the same. Vercingetorix was building not a tribal warband, but a national army, with standardized unit sizes, unified command structure, coordinated logistics. The Gauls were fighting like Romans, and they were winning. By early March, isolated Roman garrisons across central Gaul had been wiped out. Not defeated in battle, simply surrounded and starved until they surrendered or died. The survivors reported something that chilled Caesar to his core. The Gauls weren't taking Roman prisoners. They were executing them, publicly, ritually, burning them alive in wicker cages as offerings to their gods. The message was clear. This wasn't a rebellion seeking better terms. This was a war of extermination. Caesar's perfect conquest was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. And the man who had never lost a campaign was about to face his first real test. A test designed by someone who knew exactly how to beat him. Vercingetorix was 20 years old, which by Roman standards made him barely more than a boy. But the Gauls measured leadership differently. His father had been executed by his own tribe for trying to make himself king, which meant Vercingetorix had grown up an outcast, watching, learning, nursing a rage that would reshape history. He had served with Roman cavalry auxiliaries, Caesar's own forces, and learned how the legions fought, how they thought, how they won. When he raised the rebellion in the winter of 52 BC, he didn't just call for warriors to fight. He called for tribes to think, to plan, to fight Rome the way Rome fought everyone else, with discipline, logistics, and patience. His first act as war leader revealed the kind of mind Rome was facing. In late January, while the rebellion was still spreading, Vercingetorix assembled the tribal chieftains at Bibracte, the fortified capital of the Aedui, and did something no Gallic leader had ever done. He demanded they swear a formal military oath, not to their own tribes, not to their personal honor, but to him, to a unified command structure. Chieftains who had spent their entire lives as independent warlords suddenly found themselves taking orders from a 20-year-old. And they did it. Because Vercingetorix had something none of them possessed, a plan to actually win. Here's what made his strategy revolutionary. Every previous Gallic resistance had followed the same pattern. Gather a massive army, challenge Rome to open battle, lose spectacularly. When Roman discipline broke the tribal charge, then scatter into the forests and wait for the next generation to try again. Vercingetorix had watched this happen 3 times during his teenage years. He had seen armies of 50,000 warriors shattered by 15,000 legionaries because the Gauls fought with courage, but not coordination. He had learned the fundamental truth that Roman commanders preferred to keep secret. Legions were nearly invincible in pitched battle, but they were vulnerable everywhere else. So he refused to give them pitched battle. Instead, Vercingetorix implemented what military historians now call the first recorded scorched earth campaign in Western European history. His orders to the tribal councils were brutal and specific. Destroy everything Romans can use. Burn your grain stores, slaughter your livestock or drive them into the hills. Poison your wells. Abandon your towns. Every settlement within a day's march of Roman forces was to be evacuated and torched. Think about what that meant. He was asking tribes to destroy their own homes, their own harvests, condemn their own families to months of hardship, all to deny Caesar's legions the supplies they needed to operate. And the tribes did it. In the first 2 weeks of March, over 20 Gallic towns burned. Not because Romans attacked them, because Gauls destroyed them preemptively. Women and children fled to fortress settlements in the hills, while warriors formed mobile cavalry units to harass Roman foraging parties. It was a strategy that required discipline, unity, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for long-term victory. Three things Gauls had never shown before. Three things Vercingetorix had somehow conjured from a fractured nation. But he had one more weapon that Caesar didn't know about yet. A fortress that had never fallen. A mountain stronghold where geography itself was the ultimate defense. A place where Vercingetorix could force Rome's perfect military machine to break itself against stone and blood. That fortress was called Gergovia, and Caesar was about to discover that some hills can't be taken, no matter how many legions you bring. Vercingetorix's war plan was simple and horrifying. Deny Caesar everything. As Roman legions marched through Gaul trying to crush the rebellion, they found empty fields, burned villages, poisoned wells. The Gauls were destroying their own land, their own homes, their own winter stores, anything that might feed Roman soldiers. 20 towns burned in a single week. Families fled to fortress settlements in the hills, carrying what they could, leaving nothing behind but ash. It was a strategy that required iron discipline from the Gauls themselves, and it was working. Caesar's legions, accustomed to living off the land they conquered, suddenly found themselves marching through a wasteland. The scale of destruction was unprecedented in Western European warfare. Vercingetorix's orders specified exact parameters. Any settlement within 15 miles of known Roman marching routes was to be evacuated and burned. Granaries were to be emptied, and their contents either moved to fortress towns or scattered in rivers. Livestock was to be driven into remote hill country where Roman foraging parties couldn't reach. Wells were to be filled with stones and animal carcasses. By mid-March, the Betrayal tribe alone had destroyed over 40 villages. The Arverni burned 32, the Carnutes 27. Let that sink in. Nearly 100 communities reduced to ash in less than a month. Not by Roman conquest, but by Gallic strategy. Here's what Roman commanders didn't understand at first. This wasn't panic or desperation. It was systematic economic warfare. A Roman legion on campaign required approximately 40,000 pounds of grain per day to feed its 6,000 men and support personnel. Add in cavalry horses, pack animals, and the non-combat staff that followed every army, and the daily consumption climbed to 60,000 pounds. Caesar had 6 legions in Gaul. That meant 360,000 pounds of food needed every single day. The Roman supply system was built on capturing enemy granaries and requisitioning local harvests. Take that away, and the legions starved. Simple mathematics, brutal effectiveness. Caesar tried to adapt. He sent foraging parties ranging 20, then 30, then 40 miles from the main column, searching desperately for supplies the Gauls had missed. Vercingetorix was waiting. Gallic cavalry units, mobile, local, familiar with every path and stream, ambushed these foraging parties with devastating efficiency. A Roman patrol of 50 men would venture into the countryside looking for grain. They'd find a village. It would be empty, already stripped and burned. And on the ride back, Gallic horsemen would hit them from the tree line. Most didn't make it back to report. The casualty numbers told the story of a slow-motion disaster. Caesar's own account admits to losing several cohorts to these ambushes. That's at least 1,000 men, possibly twice that. But here's what the chronicles tried to hide. Those weren't just combat losses. Romans were starving. Soldiers on half rations started falling sick. Camp diseases spread faster among malnourished troops. Morale crumbled. These were legionaries who had conquered Gaul by marching hard and fighting harder. Now they were marching just as hard, but fighting hunger instead of enemies. By late March, Caesar faced a choice no Roman general wanted to make. He could continue hunting Vercingetorix across a burned wasteland while his army slowly wasted away. Or he could concentrate his forces and besiege the fortified settlements where Gauls had stockpiled their supplies, force them into the open battle they were avoiding. Vercingetorix had anticipated this. He had already withdrawn to the strongest fortress in central Gaul, a place where geography made siege warfare nearly impossible. A place where Caesar's tactical brilliance would mean nothing against vertical stone cliffs and elevation that took your breath away. Caesar took the bait. He marched his hungry, exhausted legions toward Gergovia, walking straight into a trap designed by a 20-year-old who had learned to think like a Roman. By April, Caesar's position was deteriorating fast. His legions were scattered across Gaul, trying to protect Roman interests and hunt down Vercingetorix. His supply lines were stretched to breaking. His Gallic allies were deserting, some openly joining the rebellion, others simply melting away into the forests, waiting to see who would win. And his soldiers were hungry. The scorched earth campaign meant Roman foraging parties had to range farther and farther from camp, which meant they were vulnerable to ambush. Gallic cavalry harassed every patrol, every supply wagon, every attempt to gather food. For the first time in his military career, Caesar was being outmaneuvered. The logistics crisis reached critical mass in early April. Caesar had 6 legions totaling roughly 36,000 men, spread across 400 miles of hostile territory. Each legion needed its own supply train, its own foraging operations, its own security. The 10th Legion was garrisoning positions near the Seine. The 7th and 8th were operating in Aedui territory, trying to keep Rome's most important allies from joining the rebellion. The 9th and 11th were pursuing Gallic war bands through the forests of central Gaul. The 13th was protecting the supply route back to Roman territory in Provincia. Think about that dispersion. Caesar's famous tactical flexibility, his ability to concentrate forces at decisive points, had become impossible. He couldn't mass his legions without abandoning entire regions to Vercingetorix. Here's what made the situation catastrophic. Roman military doctrine assumed that armies moved through friendly or conquered territory, where locals could be coerced into providing supplies. Caesar's legions had done this for 6 years across Gaul. They would march into a region, demand grain quotas from the tribes, execute anyone who resisted, and move on. Fast, efficient, brutal. But now the tribes weren't resisting. They were gone. The granaries were empty. The fields were ash. Roman quartermasters accustomed to requisitioning supplies found themselves staring at smoking ruins and wondering how to feed 6,000 men with nothing. The casualty reports told a story Caesar's dispatches to Rome tried to hide. Between March and early April, the legions lost over 1,500 men, not in major battles, in skirmishes, ambushes, and what the records euphemistically called foraging accidents. A sentry would ride out to search for food and simply disappear. Days later, scouts would find their bodies scattered along a forest trail, stripped of weapons and armor. Gallic cavalry was picking off Roman patrols with impunity, and Caesar couldn't stop it because he didn't have enough cavalry of his own. The German and Gallic horsemen he normally relied on were deserting or demanding payment he couldn't provide. But the worst crisis was political. The Aedui, the tribe Caesar had elevated above all others, the tribe that formed the foundation of his entire Gallic alliance system, were wavering. Their tribal council was split between the pro-Roman faction that owed Caesar everything and the younger warriors who saw which way the wind was blowing. In early April, an Aedui delegation arrived at Caesar's camp with a message. They needed grain shipments to feed their own people. or they couldn't guarantee their warriors would keep fighting for Rome. Caesar stared at them in disbelief. He didn't have grain for his own legions, and his most important allies were demanding supplies as the price of loyalty. On April 7th, Caesar made the decision that would lead him to Gergovia. He couldn't keep chasing shadows across a burned landscape. He couldn't maintain scattered legions bleeding from 1,000 cuts. He needed to force Vercingetorix into a decisive engagement. A siege, a battle, something that would let Roman military superiority actually matter. Intelligence reports placed Vercingetorix at Gergovia with a large force. The fortress was formidable, but sieges were what Romans did best. Caesar ordered his scattered legions to concentrate. 6 legions, 36,000 men, marching toward a mountain fortress that had never fallen. He was about to discover why. Gergovia sat on a plateau 1,200 feet above the surrounding valley, surrounded on 3 sides by near vertical cliffs. The only practical approach was from the south, up a slope so steep that attacking infantry would be exhausted before they even reached the walls. The Arverni, Vercingetorix's own tribe, had fortified this position over generations. Stone walls ringed the plateau. Wooden towers overlooked every approach. Fresh springs inside the fortress meant the defenders would never run out of water. And the plateau was large enough to hold not just warriors, but their families, their livestock, everything they needed to wait out a siege. When Vercingetorix withdrew his forces to Gergovia in late April, he was daring Caesar to do the impossible: assault a mountain. The geography alone made conventional siege warfare nearly useless. Roman siege engines, the ballistas, the towers, the rams that had broken countless fortifications across the Mediterranean, were designed for relatively flat terrain. They needed stable ground for construction, clear approaches for deployment, walls at accessible heights for assault. Gergovia offered none of this. The southern slope rose at a 40-degree angle for over 800 feet before even reaching the outer defensive positions. Try marching up a 40-degree incline in full armor while carrying a shield, a pilum, and a gladius. You'd be gasping for air within 200 feet. You'd be combat ineffective within 400, and you'd still have another 400 feet to go before reaching enemy lines. Here's what made Gergovia truly nightmarish for attackers. The defenders had layered their defenses in depth. The plateau itself was roughly 3 miles long and a mile wide, massive by ancient fortress standards. The Arverni had built multiple concentric walls, each one higher than the last, each one taking advantage of natural rock formations. An attacker breaking through the first wall would find himself facing a second wall 50 feet higher up the slope. Break through that one, and there was a third, and a fourth. The fortress wasn't a single defensive position, it was a series of killing grounds stacked vertically, each one giving defenders higher ground and better firing positions than the last. The numbers told the story of perfect defensive terrain. Vercingetorix had roughly 40,000 warriors concentrated at Gergovia, a mix of Arverni tribal levies, elite cavalry from allied tribes, and experienced fighters who had been raiding Roman positions for months. But the force multiplier wasn't the warriors. It was the elevation. Military historians estimate that height advantage in ancient warfare increased defensive effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 5. A defender on a wall could rain down javelins, stones, and arrows on attackers struggling uphill. Attackers couldn't effectively throw back because they were exhausted, off balance, and throwing upward against gravity. Simple physics became a weapon. And Vercingetorix had one more advantage that Roman scouts didn't fully appreciate until it was too late. The Arverni knew every path, every gully, every hidden approach on that mountain. They had lived there for generations. They knew where springs emerged, where rock falls could be triggered, where narrow defiles could channel attackers into kill zones. Romans would be fighting blind on terrain the Gauls understood intimately. Caesar's engineers surveyed the approaches and delivered their assessment. A direct assault would be suicidal. The slope was too steep, the defenses too layered, the casualties too certain. Caesar listened to their report and made the decision that would define his entire Gallic campaign. He would take Gergovia anyway. Not because he had a brilliant tactical plan, because walking away would destroy what remained of his reputation. Rome's greatest general couldn't look at a barbarian fortress and admit it was impregnable. So he ordered his legions forward into terrain designed by nature and improved by Gauls to kill Romans. What happened next would prove that even genius has limits when geography becomes the enemy. Caesar reached Gergovia in early May with 6 legions, roughly 30,000 men. He looked up at those walls and knew immediately this was a trap. Vercingetorix wasn't hiding in Gergovia because he was afraid. He was there because he wanted Caesar to attack. A failed assault would shatter Roman prestige. It would prove that Gaul's fortresses were impregnable. It would encourage every tribe still sitting on the fence to join the rebellion. But walking away was just as bad. If Caesar refused to attack, he would look weak, cautious, afraid. The same man who had stormed Germanic camps across the Rhine, who had launched amphibious invasions of Britain, who had built his reputation on aggressive, relentless offense. That man couldn't just look at a Gallic fortress and decide it was too hard. The political mathematics were brutal. Caesar's entire position in Gaul rested on the perception of Roman invincibility. For 6 years, he had cultivated an image of unstoppable momentum. Every campaign ended in victory. Every siege ended in surrender. Every tribe that resisted ended in graves. This psychological dominance was what kept 3 million Gauls under control of 40,000 Roman soldiers. The moment that perception cracked, the whole structure would collapse. Tribes currently neutral would join Vercingetorix. Tribes currently allied with Rome would quietly switch sides. The Abidui, already wavering, would openly rebel. Caesar's conquest wouldn't just stall, it would reverse. Here's what the military situation looked like on May 1st. Caesar had 30,000 legionaries, but they were exhausted from weeks of forced marches through hostile territory. His cavalry numbered less than 4,000, mostly German mercenaries, whose loyalty was transactional and currently unpaid. His supply situation remained desperate. The legions were on 3-quarter rations, and foraging parties were still being ambushed daily. Up on the plateau, Vercingetorix commanded 40,000 fresh warriors, unlimited water from mountain springs, and enough stored grain to last through autumn. The defender-to-attacker ratio was nearly equal, which in siege warfare meant the defenders had an overwhelming advantage. Caesar's officers knew it. Tribune Labienus, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant and a veteran of every Gallic campaign, advised immediate withdrawal. "We can't take this position without unacceptable losses," he told Caesar privately. "Every engineer who's surveyed the approaches says the same thing. We need to fall back, consolidate, find better ground." Other commanders echoed the assessment. This wasn't cowardice, it was tactical reality. Romans had walked away from difficult sieges before. There was no shame in acknowledging that some fortresses cost more to take than they were worth. But Caesar understood something his officers didn't. This wasn't about Gergovia. This was about everything. News of the rebellion had already reached Rome. The Senate was debating whether to send reinforcements or abandon the conquest entirely. Caesar's political enemies, and he had many, were whispering that he had overextended, that his Gallic adventure was collapsing. that it was time to recall him before he wasted more Roman blood on barbarian hills. If Caesar withdrew from Gergovia without a fight, those whispers would become shouts. His enemies would claim he had lost his nerve. His conquest would be remembered not as the triumph of Roman arms, but as an expensive failure that enriched Caesar personally while costing the Republic thousands of soldiers. On May 3rd, Caesar called a council of war and announced his decision. "We're not leaving. We're taking that fortress." His officers stared at him. Labienus started to object. Caesar cut him off. "I don't care what the terrain looks like. I don't care about the slopes or the walls or the defenders. Rome doesn't retreat from barbarians. We find a way to win, or we die trying." The room went silent. Every officer present knew what that meant. Caesar had just committed 30,000 men to an assault that couldn't succeed. And he had done it not because he saw a path to victory, but because losing his reputation was worse than losing his army. What happened next would prove that pride can be more dangerous than any enemy fortress. Caesar did what Romans always did when faced with a fortified position. He built. For 2 weeks, his legions dug trenches, raised ramparts, constructed siege towers, and fortified their own camps on the valley floor and lower slopes. They built a small fort on a hill across from Gergovia's southern approach to establish a closer base of operations. They fortified another position on high ground to protect their supply lines. And they dug, endless digging, the backbreaking labor that made Roman legions unstoppable. Caesar was creating infrastructure, turning the battlefield itself into a Roman construction project. Up on the plateau, Vercingetorix watched and led him. Every day Caesar spent building was another day the rebellion spread, another day Roman supplies dwindled, another day the psychological balance shifted. The scale of construction was staggering even by Roman standards. Between May 4th and May 18th, Caesar's legions excavated over 12 miles of trenches and earthworks surrounding Gergovia's base. Each legionary moved an estimated 2 tons of earth per day, digging defensive, ditches 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide, piling the excavated soil into ramparts another 10 feet high. Think about those numbers for a second. 30,000 men moving 60,000 tons of earth daily for 2 straight weeks. The Romans were reshaping the landscape itself, creating their own fortified positions that would protect siege operations and prevent Gallic counterattacks from the plateau. Here's what made Roman engineering terrifying to their enemies. This wasn't crude earth moving. Every trench followed precise specifications from military manuals refined over centuries of warfare. The ditches had sloped walls to prevent easy crossing. The ramparts had wooden palisades on top with sharpened stakes angled outward. Guard towers went up every 200 feet, providing overlapping fields of observation. Romans didn't just dig holes, they built fortress networks that turned open ground into controlled killing zones. The main Roman camp on the valley floor became a small fortified city, complete with streets laid out in perfect grid patterns, officer quarters, granaries, armories, and even a headquarters complex for Caesar himself. But Caesar's masterpiece was the small fort he built on La Roche Blanche, a hill about 1,000 yards southwest of Gergovia's southern slope. This wasn't just a forward position, it was a statement. By fortifying ground that close to the Gallic walls, Caesar was declaring that Roman military engineering could challenge even Gergovia's natural defenses. The fort went up in 72 hours. Walls, towers, gates, all of it. 6 cohorts, roughly 3,000 men, garrisoned the position, close enough to support an assault on the main fortress, close enough to threaten Gallic foraging operations, close enough that Vercingetorix couldn't ignore it. And that was exactly what Caesar wanted. Every defensive work the Romans built was designed to provoke a response, to draw Gallic warriors down from their impregnable plateau into open combat where Roman infantry could actually fight them. Caesar was baiting a trap, using his own soldiers as both bait and weapon. Vercingetorix didn't take it. He kept his warriors on the high ground and let the Romans exhaust themselves building. Because he understood something Caesar was trying to ignore. All this engineering, all this infrastructure, all these fortifications, they were consuming time and supplies the Romans didn't have. The legions were burning through their grain reserves to fuel the backbreaking labor. Thousands of soldiers digging 12-hour days needed more food than soldiers fighting. The scorched earth strategy was still working. By May 18th, Caesar had built everything he could build. The trenches were dug. The camps were fortified. The siege towers stood ready. Now came the moment that had been inevitable since he first looked up at those walls. He had to actually attack. What happened next would reveal the fatal flaw in Romans' military doctrine, the belief that perfect preparation could overcome impossible terrain. Caesar had built his infrastructure. Vercingetorix had built his trap. And 30,000 Roman soldiers were about to walk into it. Then came the news that changed everything. The Aedui, Rome's most important Gallic allies, the tribe Caesar had protected and elevated above all others, had joined the rebellion. Their cavalry, which should have been reinforcing Caesar's position, had instead turned around and started massacring Roman supply convoys. It was a betrayal that struck at the foundation of Caesar's entire Gallic strategy. He had built his conquest on the principle of divide and rule, using friendly tribes against hostile ones. Now the friendly tribes were becoming hostile. Caesar had to move fast. He had to do something dramatic. He had to prove that Rome was still invincible, even here, even now, even at the base of this impossible fortress. The messenger arrived on May 13th, riding a horse that had been pushed to collapse. He had covered 60 miles in less than a day, changing mounts at Roman outposts, desperate to reach Caesar before the catastrophe spread. His report was devastating. 10,000 Aedui warriors had renounced their alliance with Rome and declared for Vercingetorix. Their cavalry, 4,000 horsemen who had been escorting supply wagons from Roman-controlled territory, had turned on their escorts. Over 300 Roman soldiers were dead. The supply convoy they were protecting, containing 2 weeks' worth of grain for Caesar's legions, was now in Gallic hands. And the Aedui weren't done. They were mobilizing their full tribal levy, another 15,000 warriors, to march on Gergovia and join the siege from the inside. Let that sink in for a moment. Caesar's entire political strategy in Gaul had rested on the Aedui. He had given them privileged trade status, recognized their tribal aristocracy, protected them from rival tribes, even married his officers to Aedui noblewomen to cement the alliance. The Aedui weren't just allies. They were the model Caesar showed other tribes. See what Rome does for its friends? Submit peacefully and prosper. That model had just collapsed. If the Aedui could betray Rome, any tribe could. Every alliance Caesar had built over 6 years was now suspect. Here's what Roman commanders feared most. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The Aedui controlled the primary supply route between Roman-controlled Provincia and Caesar's position at Gergovia. With them hostile, that route was closed. The secondary routes ran through territory now swarming with rebellion. Caesar's 30,000 legionaries were effectively cut off, besieging a fortress they couldn't take while their own supply lines bled out behind them. The besiegers were becoming the besieged. Caesar read the dispatch 3 times, his face betraying nothing. His officers watched, waiting for orders, waiting for the brilliant tactical response that always came. Caesar had built his legend on adapting faster than his enemies, on turning disasters into opportunities through sheer aggressive will. But this time, the mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. He had perhaps 3 weeks of supplies left. No reinforcements were coming. The Aedui betrayal meant every tribe in central Gaul would now openly support Vercingetorix. And he was trapped at the base of an impregnable fortress with an army that was slowly starving. Most generals would have ordered immediate withdrawal. Cut losses, retreat to defensible territory, regroup and plan a new campaign. But Caesar understood something his officers didn't. There would be no new campaign. If he retreated from Gergovia now, the psychological damage would be terminal. The Senate would recall him. His political enemies would destroy him. His conquest would unravel completely. He had one choice left. Attack now, before the Aedui reinforcements arrived. Force the battle he had been avoiding. Take Gergovia through direct assault, or die trying. On May 14th, Caesar issued orders that shocked his entire command staff. He was launching a full-scale assault on Gergovia's fortifications. Not a probing raid, not a limited demonstration. A genuine attempt to storm the walls and take the plateau by force. His officers looked at him like he had lost his mind. The terrain was impossible. The defenses were layered. The casualties would be unspeakable. Caesar didn't care anymore. He was out of time, out of options, and out of patience. What happened in the next 72 hours would either save his career or end it. And it would all come down to a deception that almost worked. Until Roman discipline shattered at the worst possible moment. On the night of May 15th, Caesar launched a deception operation. He sent a large force noisily moving toward Gergovia's eastern approaches, carrying torches, making noise, creating the impression of a major assault. Vercingetorix took the bait. He shifted a large portion of his warriors to defend the eastern walls, expecting the main Roman attack to hit there. And while the Gauls were focused on the wrong direction, Caesar sent his legions up the southern slope in the pre-dawn darkness. It was meant to be a limited objective raid. Seize the outer camps that the Gauls had established on the lower slopes. Burn them. Prove Roman soldiers could reach Gergovia's defenses, then pull back before the Gauls could respond in force. A psychological victory, not a decisive one. Just enough to prove it could be done. The deception began at 10 p.m. 2 full legions, the 11th and 13th, roughly 12,000 men, marched east from the main Roman camp with torches blazing. They made no attempt at stealth. Centurions shouted orders, equipment clanked. Thousands of hobnailed boots hammered the ground in perfect rhythm. From Gergovia's walls, Gallic sentries watched the torchlight snake around the plateau's eastern side and raised the alarm. War horns echoed across the mountain. Warriors scrambled to defensive positions facing east, exactly as Caesar had planned. Vercingetorix himself rode to the eastern ramparts, watching the Roman torches, calculating when to expect the assault. He never saw the real attack coming. At 3 a.m., while Gallic attention remained fixed eastward, 3 Roman legions, the 7th, 8th, and 10th, Caesar's most experienced units, moved out in complete darkness. 18,000 men advancing without torches, without noise, weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic clinks, officers giving hand signals instead of verbal commands. They moved up the southern slope using a route Caesar's scouts had identified during 2 weeks of observation. A shallow ravine that provided some cover from observation and angled toward the Gallic outer camps, positioned about 400 feet below the main fortress walls. Here's what made this operation brilliant. Caesar wasn't trying to take Gergovia. He was trying to embarrass Vercingetorix. The outer camps housed perhaps 2,000 Gallic warriors, support troops, camp followers, reserve units that weren't deemed important enough to man the main walls. They were positioned on relatively accessible ground, where the slope was merely steep rather than vertical. If Roman legions could seize these camps, burn them, and withdraw before Vercingetorix could respond, it would prove that Gergovia's defenses weren't perfect. It would demonstrate Roman tactical superiority, and it would give Caesar something to report to Rome that sounded like progress. The attack hit at dawn. The first light of May 16th was just breaking over the eastern hills when Roman infantry emerged from the ravine 200 yards from the nearest Gallic camp. The Gauls, focused on the eastern approaches where they expected the main attack, were caught completely unprepared. Roman cohorts slammed into the outer perimeter in perfect formation. Shields locked, gladies stabbing, the relentless mechanical killing that made legionaries unstoppable in close combat. The Gallic warriors tried to form defensive lines, but they were disorganized, half asleep, facing the wrong direction. Within 20 minutes, the first camp fell, then the second, then the third. Roman soldiers poured through the positions, killing anyone who resisted, setting tents ablaze, destroying supply dumps. Gallic warriors who survived the initial assault fled uphill toward the main fortress, screaming warnings that brought Vercingetorix running from the eastern walls. He stares down the southern slope and sees what Caesar had done. Turned his attention one way while striking from another. Classic deception, and it had worked perfectly. Almost perfectly. Because now Caesar needed to execute the hardest part of any military operation, the controlled withdrawal. His legions had seized the outer camps, exactly as planned. Now they had to pull back before 40,000 Gallic warriors could counterattack from the fortress above. But when Roman soldiers looked up at Gergovia's main walls and saw Gallic defenders scrambling in apparent panic, something changed. Something that would turn Caesar's limited success into his greatest disaster. The legionaries saw opportunity where they should have seen danger, and they made a decision that would leave 700 Romans dead on a hillside. The initial assault went perfectly. 3 Roman legions, the 7th, the 8th, and the 10th, advanced up the slope in the darkness, moving quietly, professionally, the way Roman infantry had done 1,000 times before. They hit the Gallic outer camps at dawn and overwhelmed them in minutes. The Gauls, caught by surprise with their main force positioned on the wrong side of the fortress, fled back toward the main walls. Roman soldiers seized the camps, killed everyone they could catch, and prepared to withdraw according to Caesar's orders. But then something happened that shouldn't have been possible in a Roman army. The soldiers saw the main walls of Gergovia. They saw Gallic warriors scrambling to defend them. They saw what looked like confusion, panic, an opportunity, and they ignored the recall signal. The trumpet sounded at 6:15 a.m. 3 sharp blasts, the standard recall command that every Roman soldier learned in basic training. It meant disengage, reform ranks, prepare to withdraw. Centurions across the captured camps shouted the order. Fall back, reform on the standards, prepare to march. The soldiers heard them. They understood perfectly, and hundreds of them looked up at those walls 300 yards above and made a decision that defied every principle of Roman military discipline. Here's what they saw. Gallic warriors running along the ramparts, apparently disorganized. Sections of wall that looked undermanned. Gates that appeared to be closing, slowly, as if the defenders were caught off guard. To legionaries who had spent 6 years conquering Gaul through aggressive offense, it looked like the fortress was there for the taking. All they had to do was charge uphill, hit those walls before the Gauls could organize, and they would accomplish what was supposed to be impossible. They would take Gergovia. They would be the heroes who won Caesar's war with a single bold stroke. It was a mirage, and it killed hundreds of them. The first soldiers to break formation were from the 10th Legion, Caesar's most experienced, most trusted unit. Men who had fought in Britain, crossed the Rhine, survived a dozen major battles. These weren't green recruits prone to panic. These were hardened professionals who should have known better. But they looked at those walls, and decades of aggressive Roman doctrine overrode their training. Attack, always attack. Hesitation is death. Press the advantage, finish the enemy. They charged, not in organized cohorts, not in the tight checkerboard formations that made Roman infantry unstoppable, but as individuals racing each other uphill. Within seconds, hundreds more joined them. The 8th Legion saw the 10th charging and didn't want to be left out of the glory. The 7th followed. Centurions screamed themselves hoarse, trying to maintain order. Some ran after their men, trying to impose some structure on the chaos. Others stood in the captured camps, watching in horror as 6 years of discipline evaporated in minutes. Think about what this meant. Roman military success was built on one principle above all others. Obey orders instantly, without question, without hesitation. A Roman legion could maneuver in combat because every soldier knew exactly what his sentry would do, what the sentry beside him would do, what the cohort commander expected. That precision was what turned 30,000 individual soldiers into an unstoppable military machine. And now, at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible terrain, that machine had broken down. Caesar watched from his command post, 1,500 feet below. He saw his legions disintegrate into a mob streaming uphill toward walls they couldn't take. He saw the careful plan, the limited raid, the controlled withdrawal, the psychological victory, turn into disaster in real time. And he knew, with absolute certainty, what was about to happen. Because up on those ramparts, Vercingetorix was watching too. And the apparent confusion, the seemingly undermanned walls, the slow closing gates, all of it was bait. The Gauls weren't panicking. They were ready. And they had been ready since the moment the Romans started climbing. What happened in the next 17 minutes would prove that discipline cuts both ways. When you have it, you're unstoppable. When you lose it, you die. Centurions screamed orders to fall back. Trumpets blared the recall. But centuries of Roman soldiers, hundreds of men, looked at those walls and decided they could take them. They broke formation and charged uphill. Not in organized cohorts, not in the tight, disciplined formations that made Roman infantry unstoppable, but as individual warriors racing each other to be first to the walls. It was the kind of undisciplined, glory-seeking charge that Romans mocked barbarians for. And now Roman legionaries were doing it themselves. The 10th Legion, Caesar's most trusted and experienced unit, led the charge. Their centurions, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of order, charged with them. And Caesar, watching from below, saw his perfect military machine turn into a mob. The climb was 300 vertical feet across roughly 400 yards of slope. In full combat gear, Lorica segmentata armor weighing 40 pounds, scutum shield another 22 pounds, gladius, pilum, helmet, supplies. Roman legionaries were carrying 70 pounds of equipment up a 40-degree incline. The first 50 yards went fine. Adrenaline, momentum, and the thrill of imminent glory carried them forward. The next 50 yards started to hurt. Legs burning, breathing hard, but still moving. By the time they reached the halfway point, the charge had slowed to a labored climb. Soldiers were gasping for air, stumbling on loose rocks, no longer running but scrambling uphill on hands and knees in places. Here's where the terrain became a weapon. The slope wasn't uniform. It was broken by gullies, rock outcroppings, patches of scree that shifted underfoot. The charging Romans couldn't maintain any kind of formation because the ground itself prevented it. Units that started together got separated. Fast climbers pulled ahead, while exhausted soldiers fell behind. The tight Roman battle line, the fundamental tactical unit that made legions work, dissolved into scattered clumps of men spread across hundreds of yards of hillside. Each group was isolated, unable to support the others, unable to coordinate, unable to do anything except keep climbing toward walls that were now clearly, obviously, fully manned. Because Vercingetorix had never been caught off guard. The apparent confusion on the walls had been theater. While Roman soldiers celebrated their seizure of the outer camps, Gallic warriors had been quietly moving into position along the main ramparts. Thousands of them. By the time the Romans started their unauthorized charge, 40,000 Gallic warriors lined Gergovia's walls, armed with javelins, rocks, slings, bows, and the kind of cold patience that comes from defending your own ground. They waited until the Romans were committed, waited until the legionaries were spread out, exhausted, climbing with shields lowered because they needed their hands free. Waited until retreat would be almost as deadly as advance. Then, at a signal from Vercingetorix, the killing began. Javelins first. Thousands of them, thrown from ramparts 20 feet above the struggling Romans. The Gauls weren't aiming at individual targets. They were saturating zones. Throw into the mass of climbing soldiers and something will hit. The javelins fell like steel rain. Roman shields, designed for face-to-face combat, offered minimal protection against projectiles coming from above. Soldiers tried to raise their scuta overhead, but the weight and the angle made it nearly impossible while climbing. Men went down screaming, javelins through shoulders, through backs, through legs. The wounded tumbled backward, knocking down soldiers behind them, creating cascades of falling bodies. Then came the rocks. Gallic defenders had stockpiled stones along the walls for exactly this scenario. Boulders, river rocks, pieces of broken masonry, anything heavy enough to kill. They rolled them down the slope and let gravity do the work. A 20-pound rock hitting a soldier climbing uphill will shatter bones, cave in helmets, break spines. The Romans tried to dodge, but there was nowhere to go. The slope funneled them into kill zones. Rocks bounced and tumbled, gathering speed, hitting multiple soldiers before finally rolling to a stop hundreds of feet below. By 6:30 a.m., just 15 minutes after the charge began, the slope below Gergovia's walls had become a slaughterhouse, and the Romans hadn't even reached the fortifications yet. The survivors who made it to the base of the walls were about to discover that the real killing was just beginning. The Roman soldiers reached the walls and realized their mistake. Gergovia's defenses weren't in disarray. Vercingetorix had been ready. Thousands of Gallic warriors lined the ramparts, and they had the high ground. Javelins and rocks rained down on the Roman soldiers packed at the base of the walls. The legionaries tried to form testudos, the famous tortoise formations where soldiers locked shields overhead for protection. But they were too disorganized, too scattered. Men fell by the dozen, then by the 100. Centurions trying to rally, their units became priority targets. Gallic slingers and archers picked them off with deliberate precision. 46 centurions died in less than 20 minutes. Not regular soldiers, centurions, the professional backbone of the legions, men who took years to train and decades to replace. Think about those numbers for a second. 46 centurions. Each legion had approximately 60 centurions total, experienced soldiers who had risen through the ranks, who knew every tactical formation, who maintained discipline when everything went wrong. They were identifiable by their transverse crested helmets and their position at the front of their units, leading from the most dangerous positions. The Gauls knew this. Gallic archers had spent weeks watching Roman formations, learning to identify the leaders. Now they targeted them systematically. A centurion would stand up, trying to rally his scattered century into some kind of defensive formation, and 3 arrows would hit him simultaneously. Another would attempt to organize a testudo, and a slinger's stone would crush his skull. The institutional knowledge of 3 entire legions was being obliterated in minutes. Here's what made the killing ground truly nightmarish. The Romans were trapped in the worst possible tactical position. They were packed against walls they couldn't scale, on a slope they couldn't retreat down easily, under fire from enemies they couldn't reach. The base of Gergovia's fortifications became a crush of bodies. Living soldiers pressed against dying soldiers, stepping on wounded soldiers, unable to move forward or back. When you're in the middle of that mass and a javelin falls from above, you can't dodge. You can't raise your shield effectively. You just hope it hits someone else. The testudo formations that did manage to form discovered another problem. They were designed for advancing across flat ground, not for protecting soldiers pressed against vertical walls. The overlapping shields created a protective roof against projectiles, but they also locked soldiers into immobility. And the Gauls had an answer for that. They dropped heavier objects, pieces of defensive palisade, broken cartwheels, clay amphoras filled with rocks, that crashed through shield roofs like battering rams. A testudo would form, and a 100-pound log would fall from the ramparts and shatter it. The Romans trapped inside would scatter, and the javelins would find them. At 6:45 a.m., just 30 minutes into the unauthorized assault, the Romans at the wall base numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men. Impossible to count accurately in the chaos. Of those, perhaps a third were already dead or wounded. The rest were trapped, taking constant casualties, unable to retreat because of the press of bodies behind them, and unable to advance because the walls were 12 feet high and fully defended. Some soldiers tried to form human pyramids to reach the ramparts. Gallic defenders simply stabbed downward with spears, killing the men at the base and collapsing the entire structure. The Centurions, still alive, realized the terrible truth. They had led their men into a killing box with no way out. Some tried to organize fighting withdrawals, pulling small groups back down the slope in some semblance of order. Gallic warriors on the ramparts tracked these groups and concentrated fire on them. Other Centurions, seeing the impossibility of organized retreat, simply told their men to run. "Break contact. Get down the hill, now." The soldiers who obeyed survived. The ones who hesitated died. And then Vercingetorix made his move. The gates opened, not in panic, not in defeat, but in calculated aggression. Thousands of Gallic warriors poured out of Gergovia's fortress and charged down the slope toward the trapped Romans. The hunters had become the hunted, and what had been a disaster was about to become a massacre. Caesar himself rode up the slope to stop the disaster. This was not something Roman commanders normally did. Generals directed battles from safe positions, using messengers to convey orders. But Caesar had no choice. His legions were disintegrating, and only his personal presence could restore order. He rode directly into the killing ground, surrounded by his personal bodyguard, screaming at soldiers to fall back, to reform, to stop throwing their lives away. A Gallic javelin hit one of his bodyguards 3 feet from Caesar himself. Another javelin struck his horse. Caesar dismounted and continued on foot, physically grabbing soldiers and pulling them back down the slope. For several minutes, the fate of Rome's greatest general hung by a thread on a Gallic hillside, while warriors above him tried desperately to land a killing shot. The moment Caesar appeared on the slope, instantly recognizable in his scarlet general's cloak and gilded armor, Gallic archers shifted their aim. Vercingetorix himself, reportedly, pointed at the Roman commander and shouted orders to concentrate fire. Think about what was at stake in that moment. If Caesar died here, Rome's entire political structure would convulse. The first triumvirate would collapse. Pompey and Crassus would turn on each other. The civil wars that would eventually destroy the Republic would start 5 years early. And more immediately, 3 Roman legions trapped on a Gallic hillside would lose all cohesion and be annihilated to the last man. Caesar's bodyguard, 12 men of the elite Praetorian cavalry, formed a human shield around him. These weren't ceremonial guards. They were veterans chosen specifically for their combat skill and absolute loyalty. As arrows and javelins fell, they raised their shields overhead, creating a mobile testudo that moved up the slope. One guard, a Gallic auxiliary named Scaeva, took a javelin through his thigh and kept walking. Another caught an arrow in the shoulder and didn't break stride. Their job wasn't to fight. It was to keep Caesar alive long enough to reach the trapped legionaries and restore some semblance of order. Here's what Caesar was walking into: pure chaos. Roman soldiers were fleeing down the slope in complete panic, throwing away shields and weapons to run faster. Others were still trying to fight their way up toward the walls, convinced they could somehow salvage victory. Wounded men were crawling downhill, leaving blood trails on the rocks. Centurions were screaming contradictory orders, some calling for retreat, others for a final push, none of them able to impose authority over the pandemonium. And Gallic warriors were pouring out of the fortress gates, pursuing the fleeing Romans with savage enthusiasm. Caesar reached the thickest part of the fighting at approximately 6:50 a.m. He grabbed the nearest soldier, a legionary from the 10th Legion running downhill, and physically threw him back uphill. "Reform on me. Shields together. Hold this ground." His voice carried the kind of absolute authority that years of command creates. Soldiers who had been running stopped. Soldiers who had lost all hope saw their general standing in the middle of the killing ground and felt something shift. If Caesar was willing to die here, maybe they could too. A testudo started to form around Caesar. 20 men, then 30, then 50, shields locking together, creating a defensive position on the slope. Caesar stood in the center, shouting orders, directing traffic, personally positioning soldiers. A javelin hit the shield wall 2 feet from his head. A rock bounced off a shield and nearly struck his leg. His bodyguard Scaeva took a second javelin, this one through his shield and into his forearm. He switched shield hands and kept fighting. For 7 minutes, someone actually timed it later based on sun positions, Caesar held that position on the slope. 7 minutes during which the entire Roman withdrawal pivoted around a single defensive formation. Fleeing soldiers saw the testudo and rallied to it. Centurions found a command structure to organize around. The panicked rout started to become a fighting retreat. But Caesar couldn't hold indefinitely. Thousands of Gallic warriors were now on the slope, and they had identified exactly where the Roman commander was standing. The testudo was taking too many casualties. Shields were splintering, men were falling. At 6:57 a.m., Caesar made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered the retreat, not a tactical withdrawal, a full-scale evacuation. Fall back to the outer camps, maintain formation, move now. The retreat that followed would prove that sometimes survival is harder than victory. And the casualties Rome would suffer in the next 30 minutes would haunt Caesar for the rest of his life. The withdrawal was chaos. Roman soldiers, realizing they couldn't take the walls, turned and ran back down the slope, exactly what you don't do in ancient warfare. The moment you turn your back on the enemy, you die. Gallic warriors poured out of the fortress gates and pursued the fleeing Romans down the hill. They caught the slowest, the wounded, the exhausted, and butchered them. The lower slopes of Gergovia became a killing field. Bodies piled up on the paths. Soldiers stumbled over corpses and were speared from behind. The only thing that saved the retreat from becoming a complete massacre was the 10th Legion's rearguard. The same soldiers who had started this disaster by charging without orders now fought with suicidal bravery to cover their comrades' escape. The killing accelerated at 7 a.m. when the full Gallic counterattack hit. Vercingetorix had committed roughly 10,000 warriors to the pursuit. Fresh troops who had been held in reserve specifically for this moment. They came down the slope in a controlled rush, not a wild charge. Gallic cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting off escape routes. Infantry formed, hunting packs that isolated groups of fleeing Romans and surrounded them. This wasn't battle. It was butchery organized with professional efficiency. Here's what made the retreat so deadly. The same terrain that had exhausted Romans climbing uphill now killed them running down. The 40-degree slope that had them gasping for air during the assault became a death trap during the withdrawal. Soldiers running downhill in 70 pounds of armor couldn't stop quickly. They couldn't change direction. They couldn't maintain balance. When a Gallic warrior appeared in front of them, they couldn't brake. Momentum carried them forward onto spears. Men tumbled, rolled, crashed into rocks. Broken ankles, shattered knees, soldiers who fell and couldn't get back up before the pursuers reached them. The body count mounted with horrifying speed. Roman casualties during the assault had been bad, perhaps 300 dead. But in the 30-minute retreat, another 400 Romans died. Let that sink in. More soldiers died running away than died fighting. The wounded who couldn't keep pace were abandoned. Soldiers who stopped to help fallen comrades were killed alongside them. Equipment was scattered across the entire slope. Shields, helmets, pila, gladi, all dropped by men desperate to run faster. The wealth of Roman military hardware left on that hillside would arm Gallic warriors for years. But the 10th Legion's rearguard bought time with blood. Approximately 600 legionaries, men who had broken discipline and charged without orders, now formed a defensive line 300 yards below the fortress walls. They locked shields, planted their feet, and refused to run. When Gallic pursuers reached them, they held. Not advancing, not retreating, just holding ground while the rest of the legions fled past them toward the outer camps and safety beyond. The fighting at the rearguard line was intimate and brutal. No room for fancy tactics, no space for maneuver. Just shield-to-shield grinding combat where men stabbed over shield rims and pushed with their entire body weight. The Gauls had numbers, 3 warriors for every Roman in the rearguard. But the Romans had desperation and the knowledge that if this line broke, thousands of their comrades would die. They held for 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which Gallic warriors threw themselves at the shield wall and were killed or repulsed. 12 minutes that allowed the 7th and 8th legions to withdraw in something resembling order. By 7:15 a.m., the rearguard had been reduced from 600 men to fewer than 200. They were surrounded on 3 sides, taking casualties from javelins and arrows, exhausted from continuous close combat. The centurion commanding them, his name lost to history, another casualty of Caesar's selective record-keeping, made the call. Break contact. Run. Now. The survivors turned and sprinted downhill, abandoning the position they had, held at such cost. Some made it. Most didn't. Gallic cavalry ran them down in the final 200 yards before the outer camps. The Romans who reached the captured outer camps collapsed behind whatever fortifications remained. They had survived, barely. But as they looked back up the slope and saw the bodies, hundreds of bodies scattered across 400 yards of hillside, they understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Rome's legions had been defeated, not outmaneuvered, not tactically beaten, but broken through simple, brutal, undeniable force. And now came the counting of the dead. By noon, it was over. The Roman legions had withdrawn to their fortified camps, and Caesar ordered an immediate count. 700 legionaries dead, 46 centurions dead, hundreds more wounded. For a Roman army, these were catastrophic losses, not because of the raw numbers, but because of who had died. Centurions were the institutional knowledge of the legions, the men who trained recruits, who maintained discipline, who turned civilians into soldiers. Losing 46 of them in a single morning was a blow that would take years to recover from. And everyone knew it. Inside Gergovia, Gallic warriors celebrated the greatest victory their generation had ever seen. A Roman army had attacked and been repulsed. The invincible legions had bled. Caesar, Julius Caesar himself, had failed. The casualty reports told a story that Caesar's later written accounts would desperately try to minimize. The Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Caesar's own narrative of the Gallic Wars, would claim around 700 dead, phrasing it as if this were an acceptable loss for a tactical probe. But here's what the numbers actually meant. A full-strength Roman legion contained roughly 6,000 men, organized into 60 centuries of 80 soldiers each, commanded by 60 centurions. 3 legions had participated in the assault, the 7th, 8th, and 10th. That meant 180 centurions total. 46 dead represented over 25% of the centurionate wiped out in less than 2 hours. Think about that. A quarter of the experienced leadership gone. But the real damage went beyond simple mathematics. Roman military doctrine relied on centurions to maintain the system. They were the men who had served 15, 20, sometimes 30 years. They knew every formation, every drill, every tactical response to every battlefield situation. They were the living memory of how Rome fought. When a legion recruited new soldiers, which happened constantly as men retired or died, the centurions transformed them from civilians into legionaries through brutal, repetitive training. Lose your centurions, and that entire system breaks down. The replacements would be junior officers promoted too quickly, and men without the experience to command in crisis, men who hadn't earned the absolute trust of their soldiers. Here's what the Roman rank and file understood immediately. This defeat was different from anything they had experienced before. Roman legions had taken casualties in Gaul. Thousands of soldiers had died over 6 years of campaigning. But those deaths had come in victories. Men died storming Germanic fortresses, but the fortresses fell. Units were mauled in major battles, but the battles were won. Losses were acceptable when balanced against conquest. Gergovia offered no such balance. 700 men had died accomplishing exactly nothing. The fortress still stood. Vercingetorix still commanded. The rebellion still burned. And now every tribe in Gaul knew that Romans could be beaten. The psychological impact rippled through the legions immediately. Soldiers who had believed themselves part of an invincible military machine now questioned everything. If disciplined Roman infantry couldn't take a Gallic fortress, what could they take? If Caesar himself, the general who had never lost could fail this spectacularly. Was anyone truly safe? Morale, that intangible but crucial element of military effectiveness, cratered. Officers reported men talking openly about the impossibility of winning the war, about the futility of dying for Caesar's political ambitions, about whether it might be smarter to desert while escape was still possible. Up on Gergovia's plateau, the celebration was ecstatic and strategic. Vercingetorix addressed his warriors from the fortress walls, visible to the Roman camps below. He didn't need to speak loudly. Every Gallic warrior and every Roman soldier knew what this victory meant. The young king who had promised to fight Rome with Roman methods had just proven his strategy worked. Scorched earth had starved the legions. Defensive warfare had bled them. And now, tactical patience had shattered them. Messengers rode out from Gergovia within hours, carrying news of the victory to every corner of Gaul. The Aedui received confirmation that their betrayal had been perfectly timed. Neutral tribes received proof that Rome could be resisted. Subject tribes received hope that rebellion might actually succeed. Within days, the political landscape would shift dramatically. But Caesar wasn't waiting for that shift. He had one move left, a move born of desperation, pride, and the knowledge that staying at Gergovia meant watching his conquest collapse in slow motion. He was going to retreat, and that retreat would trigger the final unraveling of everything he had built. The disaster at Gergovia triggered exactly what Vercingetorix had planned. Within weeks, more tribes joined the rebellion. The Aedui, emboldened by Roman failure, massacred every Roman citizen they could find in their territory. Caesar's Gallic allies melted away. His supply situation became desperate. For the rest of May and into June, Caesar didn't besiege Gergovia. He retreated. Not in panic, but methodically, his legions withdrawing north toward more secure territory, giving up ground, abandoning positions. It was the first time in Caesar's military career that he had been forced into strategic retreat. Vercingetorix had proven something that would echo across Gaul. Rome could be beaten. The legions could bleed. Caesar was not invincible. And that knowledge changed everything about how the Gallic rebellion would unfold in the months ahead. The withdrawal began on May 20th. Caesar's legions marched away from Gergovia under cover of darkness, abandoning the fortifications they had spent 2 weeks building. They left behind siege equipment too heavy to transport, trenches that represented thousands of man-hours of labor, and the bodies of 700 soldiers still scattered on the slopes. The Gauls watched them go and didn't pursue. They didn't need to. The Romans were already defeated. Vercingetorix had achieved something no other Gallic leader had managed. He had forced Julius Caesar to admit that a position was untenable and walk away. The political consequences exploded across Gaul within days. The Aedui, who had been wavering, now committed fully to the rebellion. On May 23rd, Aedui warriors attacked the Roman colony at Noviodunum, modern-day Nevers, where Caesar had stored supplies, hostages from various tribes, and the pay chests for his entire army. They massacred the garrison, freed the hostages, seized the silver, and burned everything else. Think about what that meant. Caesar's soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Now the money to pay them was gone. The hostages he had been holding as insurance against tribal betrayal were freed, and the supplies he needed to feed his army through summer were rash. Here's what the chronicles tried to hide. By early June, Caesar's conquest was collapsing faster than he had built it. Tribes that had been pacified for years rose up. The Senones, the Parisii, the Aulerci. Peoples who had accepted Roman rule, paid Roman taxes, provided Roman auxiliaries, suddenly declared for Vercingetorix. The rebellion that had started with a handful of tribes in January now encompassed virtually all of central and northern Gaul. Only the tribes in Provincia, Roman-controlled southern Gaul, remained loyal, and even there, support was shaky. The numbers told the story of strategic disaster. Caesar had started the year with effective control over roughly 3 million Gauls. By June, that number had dropped to fewer than 500,000. His 6 legions, which had seemed adequate to garrison a conquered province, were now desperately inadequate to fight a national uprising. His cavalry, never strong, had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 horsemen after Germanic and Gallic auxiliaries deserted. His supply lines were severed. His political support in Rome was cratering as news of the defeat reached the Senate. And Vercingetorix was consolidating tribal forces for what would be the decisive confrontation. But here's where the story takes its final ironic turn. Vercingetorix had won at Gergovia. He had broken Roman prestige, triggered a general uprising, and forced Caesar into retreat. By every measure, he was winning the war. And that success would lead him to make the one strategic mistake that would undo everything. Because Vercingetorix, emboldened by victory, would decide to face Caesar in one final, decisive battle. He would concentrate his forces at a fortress called Alesia, and Caesar, desperate, humiliated, backed into a corner with his entire career hanging by a thread, would do what he always did when facing impossible odds. He would build. The siege of Alesia, which followed directly from Gergovia's aftermath, would become one of the most famous military operations in history. Caesar would surround Vercingetorix's 80,000 warriors with a double wall of fortifications so massive that it defied belief. He would fight off a Gallic relief army of 250,000 men while simultaneously besieging the fortress. And he would win so completely that Gaul would never rise again. But none of that diminishes what happened at Gergovia. For one morning in May of 52 BC, a 20-year-old Gallic king handed Rome's greatest general his only battlefield defeat. 700 Romans died, proving that some hills can't be taken, no matter how perfect your legions, no matter how brilliant your tactics, no matter how divine your reputation. Gergovia was the moment Caesar's invincibility died. And every soldier who fought there, Roman or Gaul, knew they had witnessed something that would echo through military history forever. The day discipline failed, terrain won, and genius wasn't enough.